Throughout this extraordinary school year, teachers have really played a central role in young people's lives and well-being. This has been a school year that's been marked by the global pandemic, by economic crises, a nationwide movement for Black lives, historic elections, and the most recent attacks on the Capitol. And teachers throughout all of this have been on the front lines of helping young people process their emotions, cope with stress, make sense of the world around them, and find their voice and purpose. In just the past few weeks, we've heard how teachers are creating space for developmentally appropriate conversations about what democracy means, about what it means to be represented by people who look like you, about the differences between a protest and a mob. And educators are grappling with these conversations across the whole political spectrum, across all forms of in-person, distance, and hybrid learning. This year, we saw how important SEL is, not just to help us understand our feelings, but also to teach in ways that help young people develop into leaders of a more just and caring nation. And at the same time, we've had to rethink nearly all of the traditional ways of promoting SEL in classrooms and schools. We've asked a lot of educators this year, and they faced some incredible challenges. And through all of these challenges, we heard from teachers about innovations and discoveries and new ways of educating and building relationships with students. I'm so grateful today to be joined by 3 teachers in conversation to share some of their reflections as we enter the midpoint of this incredible school year. While they'll share their personal reflections and experiences, we hope that you, the audience, will be able to take away some of the broader insights that may change the way that we see classrooms, not just right now in this moment, but potentially from this moment forward. So with that, I'd like to welcome our panelists to join us on screen. Marian Dingle is a veteran elementary school educator of 21 years who's fascinated by the intersection of mathematics and social justice. She speaks nationally about culturally responsive teaching, and she pushes the conversation through her involvement in various educational committees and organizations. She leads grade level teams and serves on her state and district mathematics committees, has written articles for publications such as Ed Week, Teacher Tolerance Magazine, and the National Council of Teaching Mathematics Journal. Currently, she serves on the Georgia Council of Teaching Mathematics Executive Board and the Teaching Tolerance Advisory Board. Welcome, Marian. Kat Kelly is an English teacher and an SEL facilitator at Austin High School in Texas. Her work has taken her students outside the classroom, including on instructional trips to Costa Rica and Thailand. She's a certified facilitator and trainer in restorative practices. She serves on Austin ISD's Race and Equity Council and is helping to form the Student Equity Council for the district. She has also worked as a mentor and instructional coach for the You Teach program at the University of Texas, the Breakthrough Collaborative, and the Austin ISD PALS program. Welcome, Kat. And Keisha Haynes is an enthusiastic educator with over 10 years in the field who left a career in the financial industry to pursue a passion for growing the characters, hearts, and minds of our youth. As an exceptional student education teacher and SEL champion in Palm Beach County School District, she desires to see children reach their fullest potential based on their abilities while supporting and meeting their individual needs in a positive, equitable, and academically challenging environment. Welcome.
Thank you.
I'm so glad to be here with all of you all. And before we begin, Marian has offered to share an acknowledgement of our land and where we're situated right now. Yeah.
Thank you so much, Justina. Today, I'll situate myself through my own acknowledgements and invite you all to do the same. To acknowledge is to accept, to admit to be true, to admit something exists. Acknowledgements set the context. I acknowledge that the land that I am on today, called Georgia, is the unceded land that once belonged to the Cherokee peoples, land that they were forced to relinquish and leave behind. I further acknowledge that my ancestors were stolen from their home places to work this unceded land. I ask a blessing from the Cherokee Nation and from my enslaved and free ancestors whose countries of origin and native languages are unknown to me. May our time together be fruitful. Personally, I acknowledge that I am a healthy and employed educator, but I am also dealing with chronic trauma. I've been teaching remotely since March, constantly wondering when we will safely return face to face, knowing that people who look like me and my students are hit hardest by this virus. Educator colleagues around the country are expected to plug the now obvious holes in systems to return to a normal that never was. As a Black woman, I'm very aware of the anti-Blackness that surrounds me. My adult children live and work in cities of highly publicized murders and arrests of innocent people who look like them. I acknowledge the extreme loss of life shouldered by those of us grieving and of the illness that many are still dealing with today. I begin with acknowledgements because context matters. I think it's important for us to acknowledge where we are as we begin so that we are aware of the lens through which we act and feel. This allows us to hear each other accurately. Again, I invite you to do the same. Thank you.
Thanks so much for starting us that way, Marian. And we'll be sharing some resources after the session too, if you want to read a little bit more about acknowledgements and the importance of them. So to get us started in conversation today, I'd love for each of you just to share a recent story about your students.
Thank you. I'll go first. As I said, I've been teaching remotely for a while, and the students that I currently teach, I've never met face to face. I remember a day when I had a student, a Black girl, who was always very eager to share her face. But this one particular morning, when we started morning meeting, she was just tussling a lot with her hair. She had a pillow over her head at one point. She had a towel over her head. She came back and then she had a hoodie on with the hoodie on over her head. And throughout these changes, I kept commenting about how beautiful her hair was and how she didn't need to cover it. So she revealed that she was not happy with her mom because her mom had not gotten to her to do her hair yet. And, we kept talking through it and we were, sharing. And eventually, the camera went off for a moment and I got concerned. But right after that, the camera turned back on and it was her and her mom. And her mom was doing her hair. And I thought how wonderful it was that she was comfortable enough to show that part of herself that, yes, my hair is a big deal to me. Yes, I'm embarrassed about it, but I am part of this community and I am going to share, even in this, current state that I'm not really happy with my mom. My mom's got to do my hair, but, here it is, but I'm here. So I was really glad that she showed up for us.
Thank you so much, Marian, for your story that you shared. So much, I know that so many of us educators can relate to those experiences and so many more. I know March 13th, 2020 was definitely a time that dramatically life changed for us as educators. We had to quickly figure out how to adjust and on how we taught our students and not miss a beat in ensuring that we could still meet their needs and in a virtual environment. I know for us here in Florida, we started out much like you in the virtual environment, and then as we ushered into the end of August, we went back to brick and mortar. But even going into from March to August, our concern was just how do we incorporate technology into this new digital environment to be able to still build that climate and culture that was positive for us and for our students. And for me personally, that caused a lot of concern of how do I help my students navigate, through this new reality of, just managing through all the things that were going on, even myself personally, managing my own emotions and reactions to the pandemic, protest in reaction to the treatment of people of color, civil unrest, and through that, I decided, you know what? my students as well as myself, we need a platform on which to express, the feelings and thoughts, and even the hopes that we had with regard to what was going on. So much of what we do as educators can't be done and can't be reached without first meeting the emotional needs of our students, and also our own emotional needs. And with that, I thought, okay, how as an educator can I bring that for my students, that forum, that openness for them to do it when they are in brick and mortar and in digital. So, I started using Flipgrid, which was an excellent tool for my students, because they really were able to express what was going on in their lives, and each other were able to share perspective and understand what their peers were going through during this time. And it was refreshing to know that what we kind of laid the ground for in brick and mortar with morning meeting and afternoon wrap-ups with regard to SEL and CASEL competencies, it was now being seen in real time, but on a digital platform, you know. So, that was definitely something that totally impacted me with regard to how my students transitioned during this time.
Oh, y'all are a hard act to follow, but I'll try to jump in. So I'm a high school teacher, and I think like a lot of teachers in the nation, but especially a lot of high school teachers, I spend a lot of time looking at black squares these days as I teach on Zoom. And I have one class that is particularly dream crushing sometimes because very rarely do I have any cameras on. And then another piece of the context is that I lost my little brother suddenly in 2019. He had a short battle with cancer and then passed away spring break that year. But anyway, so December this year in 2020, I was teaching The Things They Carried, which is one of my favorite books ever. And I like to end books together. So I was reading out loud the last chapter. And this isn't a spoiler, don't worry, but there's a little girl in the last chapter who has cancer, and she talks about her bald head and having her cap on. And I was reading out loud to a screen full of black squares and just felt myself getting emotional. And I was like, oh no, like these kids have no idea why I'm getting upset. They don't know me, I don't know them. And so my voice got kind of shaky and I paused for a second, and one of the black squares unmuted and said, Miss Kelly, do you want me to read for a couple pages? And it just touched me so much because it was such a moment of humanity, and to think, I had really struggled with that class, like, do we have any connection? And it was such a moment of connection, and I just really appreciated it and gave me hope for there is humanity and connection in such a crazy world right now. So that's my moment of hope.
Wow. I mean, I think through all of your stories, it's so incredible just to get a glimpse inside your classroom, and that phrase, that humanity and connection that you just said, Kat, I think it's so evident that throughout all three of your classrooms, that's sort of the theme that's been running with what's been going on this year and probably for a long time in your classrooms. So I'm wondering, sort of on that same theme of humanity and connection, if you could each talk a little bit about how did you prioritize SEL and equity in your classrooms before COVID? And this year, in the midst of everything that's going on that you mentioned, right? The pandemic, the movement for Black lives, everything that's going on in the past few weeks, what have you done differently? And maybe Keisha, we can start with you.
Thank you. I know for us here in Florida, I mean, in the Palm Beach County School District, we were very fortunate to be one of the schools, my school in particular, Forest Elementary, one of the schools in Palm Beach County who was part of a 5-year grant through Wallace. And so prior to this year, we were able to have explicit curriculum in our class where we were able to incorporate that into our morning meetings, our wrap-ups, and even infused throughout our curriculum throughout the day. So that was something that we were able to kind of lay the groundwork for with regard to, you know, incorporating the CASEL competencies of self-awareness, social awareness, and so forth. And that helped a lot of our students. You know, we also provided peace corners for our students to be able to have that opportunity to individually decide, you know, when they needed a brain break or when they just needed a cool down moment, you know, to control their own emotions. And so coming now into that digital platform or moving into distance learning, we were faced with how do we now do that, right? You know, even coming back at the end of August in that hybrid model of some being in brick and mortar and some still being in distance, we were like, okay, how do we still provide those opportunities for our students that they need, you know? And so we, again, we're so fortunate to have our SEL team here incorporate slides, morning meeting slides that would allow us to be able to still bring those morning meeting components in place, but in a digital platform. And, you know, I love the way the slides incorporate all of the components of morning meeting. In our morning meetings, you see that we have a greeting, which are, you know, engaging and culturally relevant, you know, where we tie in our students' culture, like on the next slide, where it shows how we greeted each other in Portuguese. And on another slide, you know, where we would talk in, you know, how to greet someone in Mandarin. And we even brought the global perspective and social studies content into our morning's meeting slides to make that connection for our students. And then there are opportunities of sharing that allow for voice and choice, where students got to kind of check in and choose whether they wanted to express how they felt that day. And class activities that were fun and engaging with mindfulness activities. And I know that benefited me a lot because I needed some mindfulness activities and some yoga. You know, and you know, then we closed out with optimistic closings where students got to practice self-awareness and social awareness and responsible decision making, you know, and it was just refreshing to know that we didn't have to take that out in a time where students really needed that climate and culture, because we were all facing things that were so challenging. You know, even with regard to our peace corners, we were like, how do we incorporate peace corners, you know, with COVID protocol in place, you know? And so we use digital sensory rooms, you know, and brain breaks throughout the day to get kids to kind of, you know, get engaged, yet distress, right? And be able to be more productive throughout their day, and teachers as well. And we ended off some of these slides as well with some fun things, because we always got to keep the fun as educators, right? And so even with these puppy faces, we got to reflect on how we really felt that day, and just do it in a way, again, that was just fun for our students.
Gosh, elementary teachers get to have so much fun. I was telling Keisha I'm going to steal some of her ideas, even though I teach the older ones. So I guess I'll speak from both of my roles, both being an SEL facilitator and then also in my own classroom. So on our campus pre-pandemic, we, similar to Keisha, have had a really strong SEL program in our district and on my campus. I think one of our major strengths is direct SEL instruction. So on my campus, we have students organized into an advisory program, and so they're receiving direct SEL instruction every week. And then we're also putting putting tools into the hands of our other teachers on campus to use different SEL and equity resources in their classroom. But I think pre-pandemic, pre the resurgence of the Black Lives Matter movement, it was pretty ad hoc and a little bit sporadic that teachers would incorporate those tools outside of their own classroom, outside of those direct SEL instruction lessons every week. But I think this year has given us a chance to all be just more intentional around that work. I know as an SEL committee on my campus, we started over from the ground level and looked at how can we become a leader in the anti-racist work on our campus. and have that be the main lens through which we look at SEL rather than a side consideration or something that happens when it's convenient. So we met together with a coalition of teachers of color on our campus and have been working to draft our vision statement and what we want our campus to look like going forward. So we're very much at the beginning of that work, but I think it's really exciting and I think it's really necessary. And so I'm excited to continue in that. In my own classroom, SEL has just always been a major part of everything that I do. I mean, the two classes that I teach are English, and then I teach PALS, which is a mentoring class, and both of those are reliant upon SEL skills. And I think I've always had the classroom that kids feel comfortable coming in and sitting down on my comfy couch and talking or not talking. I have a lot of tissues on hand and sometimes chocolate. Just, I would like to think that my classroom is one of the spaces that kids feel like they can come to. I think that this past year, though, has taught me a lot, really the past 3 or 4 years of my educational life in working towards equity in a more intentional way. I think this year I've become better at stepping up and leading some of those conversations, and also stepping back and realizing that my colleagues and my students, especially my students and colleagues of color, are always going to have more lived experience, more valuable knowledge, more trauma related to that than I do. And so a major part of my job has become to just listen.
Yeah, listening is so important. Thank you both so much for sharing that. Keisha, yeah, I'm with Kat. I gotta steal some of those slides. Fantastic, and thank you and your district for your work. And Kat, I just appreciate you so much. There's so many that are not trying to do half of what you're doing. So thank you so much. I think I was a teacher pre-pandemic who really thought I believed a lot in SEL. I would describe my classrooms the way Kat did, as you know, a place where students felt comfortable and they could emote in a safe place. But I tell you, I don't think I had a clue about SEL until going through everything that we've gone through, going through the summer, having to attend to my own emotional needs and those of friends and family, so that when we began this school year, I think I was much more cognizant and intentional about incorporating all of those things into what I'd already done, which was a heavy focus on racial and cultural identity and equity, and even spilling over into trying to influence my my colleagues and my administration. It just, I don't think it was clear to me that I just couldn't separate all of those things. Like, in order to actually attend to my students' needs, I had to address what was important to them, what their situations were. There is no such thing anymore as, you know, just this blind rule just because everyone's situation is different. Some students had been exposed to the virus. Some students had already experienced death by August. Students' knowledge of, you know, what was happening with the pandemic was varied. Their cultural knowledge was varied. We had to go back and talk about everything life since March, and do that in a very slow and methodical and intentional way. So I think more than anything, my knowledge that grace is important, and that education, true education and knowledge, just cannot be rushed. This is a time where we have to give grace to each other and have to acknowledge that we are all in this together. Like no one truly wins without all of us winning. Like my well-being depends on, not only you wearing a mask, but that mask is a metaphor, right? For everything. I do not succeed unless you care for yourself and you care for me. And you can't succeed unless I care for myself and care for you. Like the connection is there. So I think for me this year, as I grow in that knowledge, that's what I'm trying to hopefully, pass on to my students, that we all grow in the knowledge that we are really all in this together.
Wow, I mean, I think just hearing you all share about what you're teaching in your classroom, right? Like it goes so much beyond, even though I know you're also doing all this incredible work around the content areas and the standards and all these other things that you're teaching. It's just so evident that these components around SEL and equity that you're bringing in, right, are about teaching your students so much more than that, and teaching about those connections and how we're supporting one another, while also bringing your own humanity and your own sense of self and your own SEL into this work. So thank you guys for sharing that. On that theme, I was thinking about something you all mentioned at the beginning, which is beginning the school year teaching a classroom potentially of students that you had never met in person before. And we all know how important that sense of community and sense of belonging is to a classroom. And wanted to just hear from you all about how have you built relationships and community, and maybe not just with your students, but with colleagues during this time. And I know you're in sort of different spaces in terms of remote learning or in-person learning. But what are some strategies you all have been using to build that sense of community and belonging?
Sure, I'll jump in first on that one. So let me start with my students because they're my favorite. But I was so overwhelmed by that at the beginning of the school year. I mean, I consider myself somebody that's really good at building relationships with students, and I had no idea how that was going to work. I think, I put a lot of structures in place. I did a Google survey, tell me who you are and what your interests are and what you're good at. I had a one-on-one conversation with each of my pals that were going to be mentors, asking about their lives and experiences. I got the chance to read college essays from my seniors, which always tell you a lot about kids. But I still felt like there were a lot of kids who I had never seen and I never knew. But it was a couple weeks ago in class that in my senior English class that almost all the squares were black, but the kids were joking around with each other and with me in the Zoom chat. One of the girls was running late, and so I said, hey, text your best friend and tell her, get on the Zoom, I miss her. And another kid, I said, hey, are your little siblings there with you right now? Because if so, I'll try to make Macbeth as least violent as possible. And I was just like, I know a lot about these black squares, like a lot more than I thought that I did. And I think that's come with just being really focused on the details this year. I find myself remembering things about students way more than I do in a normal year because there's not as much background noise or as much busyness happening. And I think I found myself really cherishing the cameras on moments, the sticking after class to talk about something moments. And in some ways, I think my relationships have gotten even closer with students than in a normal year. And with my colleagues, I mean, I've been at my same school for 12 years, so they're essentially my family at this point. I think a few years ago, though, we started to get really intentional about using restorative circles on our campus and building community with colleagues and with students via that as a platform. So that's one of the initiatives that I run on my campus is we have our staff organized into staff circles that meet about 3 to 4 times a semester and just process and joke and vent and really get to know each other in a deep way. And I grew up in a family that has been using restorative circles since the 70s. We always have on every holiday. which I didn't realize was weird until I got older and started inviting friends to holidays. And he said, your family doesn't celebrate Christmas the way the rest of us do. But so for me, that's something that's been very natural, but not always for all of our colleagues. But now that we're 3 or 4 years into using them as a campus practice, I think people have gotten used to them, and we've really grown closer as a staff. And so that's something I really appreciate about our relationships on campus.
Kat, I applaud you. As an elementary teacher, I'm only responsible for one group of kids. And I see them multiple times a day, but it's the same group. So in a lot of ways, it's much easier for elementary teachers, or at least those of us that teach one group of kids, to build those relationships. I think I spent a lot of time thinking about this, of course, in March and April. And for me, I recently, it's a weird story, but I was never into social media until a few years ago. And I joined Twitter wanting to build some kind of, professional community. And what I have found is that and more, like so many of my really, really good friends I've met through Twitter. And it's crazy. I remember going to a conference a few years ago, and my kids were like, "Oh, so where are you going, and who are you going with, and who are you staying with? Do I know them?" And I told them it's one of my friends I met on Twitter, and they were like, "Do you know them?" I'm like, "Yeah, we're friends, but have you ever met them?" Well, no. And you're sharing a room with them? Like, are you crazy? Like, this is what you have been telling us never ever to do, right? Um, and it was true, but I have met many, many people, in real life, and some not in real life, from Twitter. And I had to say that those people I leaned on throughout this pandemic. And if I can create authentic friendships through a virtual platform, then why couldn't I do that with my students? So it kind of made me feel a little bit better entering into this with a new class. And Kat, I can relate to you reading the book to your class. My mother died in September, like over 20 years ago. And every year on her birthday, I read the same book to my class, and it explains, kind of why I'm sad. And it's an excellent book. And it was probably completely illegal, but I took some snapshots and I put them on slides so I could, because the illustrations are important. But that usually in person is, a moment where, we bond in a way that we haven't before, and kids share about, their stories. Maybe they've lost a parent or, a loved one or something, and, we have tears and all that. And that, was the same way, even over a screen. So I can relate to that. I think with colleagues, there was a moment this year where I was asked to lead a math PD during a staff meeting, and I can't remember what had happened at that moment, but something, of course, jarring had happened. And I chose to lead that PD in a grounding of where we were and how we were doing with our racialized students. And I shared personal stories, and I got really vulnerable. And I think it was tough for people to hear, but I think we grew as a community through that, because there were just, up until that point, there was a lot of things that had not been shared, not wholly. Like there were pockets of people that would, go to each other for, their own comfort, but not as a staff. So I think from that moment, um, things have gotten better. I think we're able to talk a little bit more openly and say things that we haven't said in an open forum. So I mean, yeah, like they say, when you have lemons, that lemonade tends to taste really good because it has to. because it's either lemonade or, you know, you die of thirst. It's you know, it's one or the other. Anyway, what are you thinking, Keisha?
Thank you, ladies, for sharing. You know, it's funny. You're right. It starts with the dialogue. You know, I think one of the things I've walked away with from this time in building relationships and community is, you know, learning to fill cups instead of poking holes. You know, it can be so easy to cast judgment or make assumptions of people, but you know, it's so much more rewarding to be able to, like you said, listen and just hear the conversations of what people are going through. You know, opportunities to just empathize. You know, I know, you know, much like you, Kat, you know, last year I lost my mother-in-law, and even though it wasn't due to COVID impacted that. You know, we weren't able to give her the homecoming, you know, or homegoing that we traditionally are used to doing in Black culture. And so that was hard. That was hard. And but even in that moment and that experience, it allowed me to be able to connect with my students who had also lost loved ones, you know, and who were also going through not being able to do things the way they were accustomed to doing, you know, not understanding why they couldn't go and hug grandma or why they couldn't go to the park with grandpa, you know. And so being able to empathize with those experiences that my students were going through was so powerful in building that community, to know that they weren't alone, that we were in it together. And you know, we did things that even motivated them and their families to know that we were there with them by, you know, like things as practical as school car parades, where the whole school went through the neighborhood in cars and just said, we miss you, we can't wait to see you when school started back. You know, and for parents, even building that capacity of moving into, okay, how do I allow my kid to do virtual learning, and you know, offering them after school teacher hours, you know. And that wasn't something that was mandated by our district. Teachers just rose to the occasion, and we said, you know what, this is what our community needs, and we provided it, you know. And you know, with my peers, I think just that camaraderie of knowing that we were in this together, much like you said, Marion, that we were in this together, you know. Even in this past few months on my campus alone, we've had many employees who've lost loved ones. And so just having those opportunities to just, you know, and I know it's scary, you know, Marion, I think you mentioned that you are going to be soon going back into brick and mortar. It was scary for us coming back, much like everyone, into brick and mortar. But if I can tell you that the reward that comes from being able to see someone face to face, your colleagues, when you're going through that, has been priceless, you know. And I think with that, it's allowed us to, you know, even promote mini PDs on adult self-care, you know, and mindfulness, and you know, finding that balance between work and home life, you know. And even within our group as educators, we've also caused a bridge to happen between some of our trailblazers, you know, our people that were good at technology, helping those who weren't so good at technology. And I think the last thing that really helped us to build community amongst the peers was just those opening rituals and those optimistic closings, where we got to just talk about personal stuff, get to know each other better, and just offer that support to keep us going throughout this time. Thank you.
Thanks, Keisha. I mean, I think it's just incredible. You know, at the beginning of the pandemic, when we all went virtual, there were so many questions about how are we going to do this? How are we, especially when we talk about SEL that's so built on the interactions and the relationships. And I think just what we've seen from teachers during this time on how they've been able to build relationships across so many different channels, whether it's been virtually, whether it's been those car parades, and you know, and understanding their home lives, where when mom's braiding their hair and the losses they're experiencing. has just been really incredible to see. And you know, as I think about the last couple weeks as well, and this isn't a question we prepared you all with, but I do think in light of the last few weeks, and you all being in really different political spaces, I mean, across Georgia and Austin, Texas, and Palm Beach, Florida, I am wondering if any of you have anything to share about how you've taught about potentially traumatic news events, and also, you know, how have you brought SEL at all into this to create that space for your students to process losses they experience on their own, but also the sense of loss of identity, or the sense of what does this news mean for where I'm situated in the world. So, I mean, if any of you have anything to share on what you've done, would love to hear that too.
I can speak to that because on my campus, I was the person in charge of writing the lesson that all the other teachers were going to use with their students to help them process the events on January 6th. And it's always difficult to write lessons for other people to use, and for students that a lot of whom I know, but a lot of whom I don't. I mean, we have 2,400 students on my campus and about 150 people that were going to be leading this lesson, helping students process. And like you said, I'm in Austin, Texas, which is a complicated political sphere in and of itself, because it's a very progressive city in the midst of a very conservative state. And so there's a lot of tiptoeing and acknowledging that needs to happen. So I really appreciated the group of my colleagues that came together very quickly to work on that. It was especially me and my student teacher, who's a Black woman, who worked on this lesson together. And, you know, bless her, she's a student teacher. This should not be in her job description at all. But we wanted to make a space for students to talk about their feelings, to ask questions, to get accurate information, to share their different perspectives with one another. And we asked students to especially make room and step back to hear the voices of the other students who have often been marginalized or whose voices have been silenced in our country. And so we had an introduction sort of setting the foundation for the space. Then we went through a brief timeline just so students would have accurate facts of what happened on January 6th. And then we gave students the opportunity to, like I said, discuss their feelings, their questions, their identity, and how that affected their reaction and their thoughts about the events of that day. And then we also gave students the option to journal if they would rather process their thoughts silently rather than discussing with a group of their peers. And I've heard a lot of feedback from students and from teachers that it went really well, but it was definitely scary. Something I've never written a lesson about before, and I wanted to hold space for all of our students, but like I said, especially students who have often been marginalized on our campus and in our country. So I did it carefully, but I think we did it pretty well as a campus.
Keisha, do you want to go ahead, or I can go?
I can. I know definitely, you know, on the elementary side, of course, there's only so much, as far as what we can discuss and make it still sensitive to the age of our students, but with the recent events in the news, what we tried to do this past week even was just to connect how we treat one another, again, those relationship skills and the power of what we say, through even the use of Jamboards. Like we used the Jamboard that was shared just to talk about the power of words, and helping our students to understand that, what you say has power. It has power to either inspire or to tear down, to build up or to tear down. And so, we try to do that with our students to be able to make that connection. And then also using, inspiration rooms where we were able to balance some of that negativity of saying, you know what, but this is how you can counteract that, you know? And the kids loved it because it was an opportunity for, yes, them to reflect on something that was scary, because it was, the March on the Capitol was scary for a lot of our students. And it made them have a feeling of insecurity, and so as educators who are on the front lines, and we have to be in a situation where, we're with our students throughout the day when they've left mom and dad and they now are going through their day saying, am I going to be okay? To foster those relationships and put things in place to let them know, you know what, we're with you with this. We feel what you're feeling, and we're offering an opportunity to counteract some of that with positivity through SEL.
The importance of morning meeting and creating that space for authenticity and emotion, I think was key to even begin to have that conversation. I think for a lot of us who maybe hadn't done that yet or hadn't really known how to do it, it was talking about things just seemed terrifying, and it would be to me too. I, for the last few years, have been trying to ground our social studies lessons in current events anyway. So we had gotten in the habit of talking about current events all the time. Connecting the year before, my students were supposed to learn the three branches of government, for example. So everything this year with the election has been connecting, what's happening, and especially with, why is Georgia in the news right now? Why is everyone watching the Georgia Senate race? What's a runoff? All of those things. So talking about what was happening in the world and especially in the country was already normalized. And also, like I said before, we talk a lot about identity. So I remember when Chadwick Boseman died, I came to class and we've always been honest with each other. And I said, I'm hurting. I'm really hurting. And we talked about it. Some students had seen the Black Panther, some hadn't. So we talked about why this movie and why this actor in particular was so important to the Black community and why it felt like such a blow. And we really got into identity. And when in the movie even is this refrain of, who are you? I am this, I am that. We read books about identity, who you are. So for recent events, it was not only, like I also teach fourth grade with Keisha, like Keisha does. And for those students, a lot of times it's not just how do we respond to this with my identity, it's us filling in the blanks of, what the facts actually even were. And I credit a lot to Newsella. They provide accurate, timely, not watered down, factual news articles for kids that are accessible to different grade levels. So we got the facts from that. But I think from my math background, I'm a notice and wonder type of person. So for recent events, it was showing them, like making sure that they had the words, the vocabulary, the facts, but also showing them images and me choosing those images so they weren't necessarily scary or violent, but just images so they could practice reading the world, reading and writing the world. What is it that they see? What do they notice? How does that make them feel? And leaving space for that conversation as I and the rest of us were processing what was happening too. It was scary for all of us. I'm still scared.
Thank you all for sharing that. I mean, the responsiveness as teachers you've had to be this year to all of the things that have been going on in the news and in your own lives and in students' lives, I think it's just so evident. Thanks for sharing those strategies. And as our final question, we'd love to hear just what's something that you each have discovered about your school community, about education generally during this time that you really think you'll carry forward long after this year is over. And maybe Marian, we'll start with you this time.
Okay. That's really a great question. I ask myself that all the time. Like, what is it? This year is so hard. What on earth am I supposed to be taking from this, right? Because there's supposed to be something that I'm supposed to glean. I don't know that I could characterize it as discovery, but I think I'm coming away with a deeper sense of what schooling in our country has come to mean. That schooling is not just about education. Schooling, you know, for good or for bad, has come to mean that we hold the children while the economy flows. And for me, that's a stark realization that, you know, the push for everything to return to normal rests so heavily on school and educators, because we are not just educators, we're part of a functioning economy. I think I know on a deeper level how intricate the relationships I have and need to be with parents and families. In the beginning, for example, of this school year, there were a lot of tech issues. All my students had district devices, but maybe they forgot their passwords, or maybe they weren't working, or maybe the charger wasn't working, or whatever it was. They just weren't used to doing this way all day, every day, unassisted. And it's hard to talk a child through how to do something with a device over the phone or over FaceTime on a screen when they've never done it before, right? Because you can't really see them on the screen until they get on the screen. So you're talking to them, FaceTiming and texting with mom, trying to get them to get to see you on a screen, which still isn't great, but it's something. So I think for a lot of us, we got really close to our families really quickly because we had to. So I think for me, in trying to be hopeful, there's definitely a greater sense of the potential of our humanity. I know it's there. In the beginning, there was a lot of talk of how we could all reimagine education. We don't really talk about that so much because we've kind of reverted back to the way it was before. How can we just replace what we had before? But I still have hope in our ability to collectively care for each other. And maybe it comes from educators themselves resisting and saying no to things that are harmful for kids. Maybe it comes from, district leaders who are ready to reimagine, or states or parents or the kids themselves, but something's got to give.
Thank you, Marian, for sharing that. I think if there would be any one discovery for me during this time, it would be just exploring the question of equity in distance learning. When this initially started, we had students who didn't have internet, and where a whole community of students didn't have it. And so we had to find a way around that to be able to say, how can we support them as a school, as a district, to ensure that they were able to still get that academic piece that they needed, to ensure that they were still safe at home, but yet we were still able to meet them and at where they were at. And you know, what it helped me realize is that not all homes are created equal. You know, not all learning spaces or learning environments are created equal. You know, so many of our students, you know, in the school that I'm in, you know, when they came up on that screen, there might be multiple families in the background, right? And so because there are students that live in multi-generational homes, you know, there are students that live in homes that have multiple families, you know, there. And so it helped me to explore how we need to look beyond just assuming that everyone has this perfect square of what their environment looks like. And it doesn't make it better, it doesn't make it worse, but it's theirs, you know, and there's a pride in what is theirs. And as an educator, understanding that I need to appreciate that and meet our students again at where they're at, you know, and that goes back again, filling that cup, not poking holes, right? You know, I know as an educator, you know, one of the things, the technologies that I had recently seen come into play was, you know, Google Meet put backgrounds. And I have to tell you, initially, I was kind of like, oh no, it's a distraction for our students. But you know what? I took a step back and I reflected and I said, you know what? This allows some of our students to have the opportunity to put something in the background that allows for their family who might be getting ready for work to walk by and not feel like, you know, I have to, you know, creep around these four walls, which we live in, you know. And so that was, you know, something that I really took away from, and it opened conversations, right? Like, why did you pick that background? You know, what does it make you think about? And so students again were able to have that voice and choice in how they showed up, right? And so, I mean, I close to say that if from all of that, what I gleaned is that offering solutions and understanding is so much more powerful than judgment and criticism. And it's something that we all need.
Like I said, y'all are a hard act to follow. And I've often said throughout this that I can't imagine how my elementary school colleagues are doing it. I mean, my students are 16 to 18, and yes, I have 150 of them, but all of them know how to turn on a computer. Most of them know how to get to their like learning management classroom online. So I don't know. Y'all are just doing the good work out there. One of the sentiments that I've heard over and over throughout this, Keisha, is that we may all be in the same storm, but we're not in the same boat. And realizing that our students and all of us are just, like you said, in so many different situations, and learning about that and making room for it. I think one of the discoveries that I've had through this isn't so much a discovery, but it's a reaffirming just how much I cherish all of the little things. I mean, I can't wait to high five a kid again or, you know, we don't have very many students on our campus right now. There are 10 kiddos here. And so we're sitting in classrooms by ourselves. And I'm like, y'all, I just want to walk past a kid I know in the hall and say, what's up? And I think that's something that I'll leave this year with, is just an increased appreciation for how important all those small moments are. And then going back to Marion's point, I mean, my high school has been around since the 1800s, and we are a big fan of tradition and of doing things the way they've always been done, because that's how they've always been done. And I think this year has taught us, you know, throw it all out the window. Like we can't continue to do it that way. And I do worry about, like you said, reverting back to the way it's always been done, or trying to do school in a way that isn't good for kids. But I'm hoping that this year shows us just how adaptable we can be, and what our priorities really should be, and that we can stop some of those educational practices that are either harmful or stagnant, and take this opportunity to reinvent ourselves and our classroom in a way that really supports kids, supports SEL, and supports equity.
Thank you all so much for sharing and for taking time out of your really busy days to be here with us today. I think the role that you all are playing in really centering SEL and equity in your classrooms for your students during this time is really just remarkable, and so really appreciate that. And as we close out here, I do want to, say to our audience that as incredible as the teachers are who are here with us today, that they can't and shouldn't do this work alone. And that we know that even though we're talking to teachers today, that school and district leaders and policymakers play an incredibly important role in creating the types of conditions, the resources, and the support for SEL. So at CASEL, if you've been following with us, we often talk about a systemic approach to SEL. And I hope that you all will see the role that you play in making sure that your school or your community has given educators like Marion, like Kat and Keisha, the type of support they need to create high quality SEL opportunities, equitable learning environments, and really not go back to the normal, the way it was before, but to do things that we should be doing for students.